The moment Aaliyah Brooks spoke those 4 words, "That number is wrong," a billionaire's empire began to crumble. But what she didn't know was that exposing Veronica Sterling's lies would unleash a revenge so cruel, it would nearly destroy everything Aaliyah held dear. This is the story of how one black woman's courage to speak truth to power changed the fate of Manhattan's most ruthless CEO, and why he's now begging for her forgiveness. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me bless your day with a prayer for abundance and protection. May your heart be open to receive the blessings coming your way, and may you recognize the power within you to speak your truth, no matter who stands against you. If you're ready to receive this blessing, type present in the comments right now. Family, if stories of courage, forbidden love, and justice make your heart race, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button because we're about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, love, and redemption. And don't forget to ring that notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this incredible story. The Sterling Manor restaurant hummed with the quiet elegance that only comes with old money and older secrets. Crystal glasses caught the amber light of the chandeliers, while whispered conversations about mergers and acquisitions floated through the air like expensive perfume. In this world of privilege and power, most people were exactly what they appeared to be: wealthy, connected, and completely convinced of their own importance. But on this particular evening, as Manhattan's elite gathered for their usual displays of excess, 3 people sat at the center of a web of deception that was about to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. None of them knew it yet, but by the time the evening was over, fortunes would shift, hearts would break, and the truth, buried deep beneath layers of lies and manipulation, would finally claw its way to the surface. And it would all begin with a waitress who noticed something that everyone else had been paid to ignore. Aaliyah Brooks had been invisible for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. At 26, she moved through the Sterling Manor like a shadow, her natural curls pulled back into a neat bun, her brown eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing. The expensive suits and designer dresses that filled the restaurant's mahogany-paneled dining room barely register her presence, except when they needed their glasses refilled or their plates cleared away. But Aaliyah saw everything. She noticed when Mrs. Pemberton slipped her wedding ring off before her lunch meetings with men who weren't her husband. She remembered that Mr. Davidson always ordered the same wine when he was about to fire someone, as if the ritual gave him courage for the unpleasant task ahead. She catalogued every conversation, every gesture, every subtle shift in the power dynamics that played out over expensive meals and carefully crafted lies. Tonight was no different, except for the exhaustion that seemed to seep deeper into her bones with each passing hour. This was her second shift of the day, and her feet ached in the sensible black shoes that had seen too many long nights. But she couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to miss even a single shift. Not when her mother's medical bills kept piling up on the kitchen table at home, not when her 17-year-old brother Marcus was depending on her to keep him in school and out of trouble. The weight of responsibility had settled on Aaliyah's shoulders 7 years ago, when her father collapsed on a construction site and never got back up. She still remembered the moment the phone call came, how the world tilted sideways and never quite righted itself again. At 19, she'd gone from college student to family provider overnight, trading her dreams of becoming a teacher for the harsh reality of survival. Her father had been the rock their family was built on, and when he was gone, it fell to Aaliyah to hold everyone together. Her mother, Grace, had never fully recovered from the loss. What started as grief had morphed into something deeper, something that required medications they couldn't afford and doctor visits that ate up whatever small savings Aaliyah managed to scrape together. And Marcus, brilliant, stubborn Marcus, was at that age where the streets beckoned with promises of easy money and quick solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. As she balanced a tray of crystal glasses, Aaliyah caught her reflection in the mirror that lined the restaurant's back wall. Her father's eyes stared back at her, warm and determined, carrying the same quiet fire that had driven him to work 3 jobs to provide for his family. She'd inherited more than his eyes. She'd inherited his work ethic, his pride, and his unwavering belief that every person deserved dignity, no matter what circumstances had brought them low. The wealthy patrons of the Sterling Manor saw none of this, of course. To them, She was simply part of the restaurant's elegant atmosphere, as interchangeable as the linen napkins and polished silverware. They spoke freely in front of her, as if she were a piece of furniture incapable of understanding or judgment. They never imagined that the woman refilling their water glasses had graduated valedictorian from her high school, or that she'd been accepted to Columbia before life forced her to choose between her dreams and her family's survival. But their blindness was her advantage. While they dismissed her presence, she absorbed their secrets, filing away information with the precision of a court stenographer. It was a skill born of necessity. Knowing who held power and how they wielded it had kept her employed in a job market that had little patience for young black women without connections or advanced degrees. Tonight, as she wiped down tables and reset place settings for the next wave of Manhattan's elite, Aaliyah found herself thinking about the conversation she'd overheard earlier. Two women in Chanel suits had been discussing their son's private school admissions, casually mentioning donations that exceeded Aaliyah's annual salary. The casual way they threw around numbers that could transform her family's life made her chest tighten with something between anger and longing. She was still lost in thought when she noticed him watching her. Ethan Harrington commanded attention without trying, the kind of man who could silence a room simply by walking into it. At 34, he possessed the sharp-edged confidence that came with building an empire from the ground up, though most people didn't know about the ground-up part. They saw the tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the platinum watch that caught the light when he gestured during conversation, the way other powerful men leaned forward when he spoke, as if his words carried the weight of prophecy. Harrington Global had started as a small real estate development company inherited from his grandfather, but under Ethan's leadership, it had metastasized into something larger and hungrier. Real estate had been just the beginning. Now the company's tentacles reached into technology, media, hospitality, and a dozen other industries that most people didn't even know existed. When Ethan Harrington sneezed, stock markets in 3 countries caught cold. He sat at his usual table, the corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the restaurant's main dining room. The table was always held for him, even when he didn't have a reservation, because men like Ethan Harrington didn't make reservations. They simply arrived and expected the world to accommodate them. And it always did. But tonight, something was different. As Aaliyah moved through her section, she could feel his gaze following her, not with the casual entitlement she'd grown accustomed to from wealthy men, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. When she approached his table to refill his water glass, their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. Most service staff learned early to keep their gazes lowered, to make themselves as unobtrusive as possible, but Aaliyah had never mastered that particular art of invisibility. For a heartbeat, she saw something flicker across his features, surprise perhaps at finding himself truly seen by someone whose job it was to remain unseen. But the moment passed quickly, and his attention returned to the woman sitting across from him, the woman who held his future in her perfectly manicured hands. Veronica Sterling represented everything that old money Manhattan believed about itself. That breeding and breeding alone determined worth, that some people were simply born to rule while others were born to serve. At 29, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that graced magazine covers and charity gala programs, her platinum blonde hair always arranged in perfect waves that never seemed affected by weather or circumstance. Her features were classical, almost marble-like in their perfection, as if she'd been carved by a master sculptor who understood exactly what American aristocracy should look like. She wore her engagement ring like a crown, the massive diamond catching the restaurant's ambient light and throwing rainbows across the white tablecloth. It was a ring that had been photographed for society pages and lifestyle magazines, a symbol of the merger between 2 of Manhattan's most powerful families. Because that's what their relationship was, really, a business arrangement disguised as a love story, a strategic alliance that would combine the Sterling family's old money influence with the Harrington Empire's new money innovation. But beneath Veronica's porcelain exterior lurked something far more calculating than simple social ambition. She had spent years positioning herself for this moment, carefully cultivating relationships and gathering intelligence the way a general might prepare for war. Her smile never faltered, her laugh rang with practiced authenticity, and her conversation flowed with a kind of effortless charm that made people forget they were being manipulated until it was far too late. Tonight, she had brought documents, a business proposal that would expand Harrington Global's reach into European markets, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She spread the papers across the table with theatrical flourish, her voice honey-sweet as she explained the intricate details of shell companies and offshore accounts. To anyone listening, it sounded like the kind of complex but legitimate business arrangement that built empires and secured dynasties. Ethan listened with the focused attention he brought to all business matters, his sharp mind automatically calculating risks and rewards, profit margins and market opportunities. He trusted Veronica's business acumen almost as much as he trusted her love, never suspecting that both might be elaborate constructions designed to serve purposes he couldn't imagine. After all, why would he suspect the woman he was going to marry of anything more sinister than the usual social climbing that characterized their world? But Veronica's plan was far more sophisticated than simple gold digging. She had been moving pieces on this particular chessboard for 3 years, ever since their engagement had been announced in the society pages. Every business deal she'd recommended, every social connection she'd facilitated, every pillow talk conversation about company strategy had been carefully orchestrated to serve a larger purpose. She was playing a long game that would make her one of the wealthiest women in America, and she was so close to checkmate that she could almost taste victory. The document she'd presented tonight contained a single, seemingly insignificant alteration, a number changed by just enough to redirect millions of dollars into accounts she controlled. It was the kind of subtle manipulation that required intimate knowledge of Harrington Global's financial structure and complete access to Ethan's trust. She had both, and she wielded them with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a predator. As she watched Ethan review the papers, Veronica felt the familiar thrill of a plan coming together. He would sign the documents, the money would flow, and by the time anyone noticed the discrepancy, she would be untouchable. She had covered her tracks too well, built too many layers of protection, cultivated too many powerful allies who had their own reasons for keeping her secrets. She was so confident in her web of deception that she barely noticed the waitress who approached their table to clear away their appetizer plates. Service staff were background noise to Veronica, no more worthy of attention than the restaurant's expensive wallpaper or carefully arranged flowers. It never occurred to her that someone whose job it was to remain invisible might also be perfectly positioned to see everything. Aaliyah had been serving Ethan Harrington for 6 months, long enough to recognize the patterns in his business dealings. She remembered the conversations he'd had with his financial team just last week, remembered the specific numbers they discussed regarding the European expansion project. She had a memory like a steel trap, a skill her father had always marveled at when she was a child. That girl could remember a grocery list from 6 months ago, he used to say, pride evident in his voice. It was that memory that made her pause as she reached for Veronica's champagne flute. The number highlighted in yellow on the document spread across the table was wrong, not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough to matter. Wrong enough to redirect $47 million into accounts that hadn't been mentioned in any of Ethan's previous discussions with his team. For a moment, Aaliyah felt her world tilt the same way it had when she'd gotten the call about her father. This wasn't her business, wasn't her problem, wasn't her place to interfere. She was just the waitress, just the invisible woman who poured wine and cleared plates and pretended not to hear the secrets that swirled around her like expensive perfume. But as she looked at Ethan's trusting expression, as she watched him prepare to sign documents that would cost him a fortune, something stirred in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd had when she'd watched her father's boss try to cheat the family out of his life insurance payout. The same righteous anger that had made her fight for what was right even when fighting seemed hopeless. She thought about her family's struggles, about all the nights she'd lain awake calculating and recalculating their bills, trying to find money that didn't exist to pay for necessities they couldn't afford. She thought about the casual cruelty of a system that allowed some people to steal millions while others worked themselves to exhaustion for pennies. And she thought about her father, who had raised her to believe that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than protecting yourself. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade into background static as Aaliyah wrestled with her conscience. Speaking up would risk everything: her job, her family's security, potentially their safety. But staying silent would make her complicit in theft on a scale that dwarfed anything she could imagine. $47 million could fund her mother's health care for several lifetimes, could send Marcus to any college he wanted, could lift 1,000 families out of the kind of poverty that had defined her entire adult life. As she watched Ethan reach for his pen, something in his expression stopped her cold. For just a moment, his carefully constructed mask of business confidence slipped, and she saw something vulnerable underneath. He wasn't just a billionaire making another deal. He was a man who trusted the woman he loved, a man who had no idea he was about to be betrayed by the person closest to him. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix the fundamental inequalities that made her world so different from his, but she could prevent this one injustice from taking place. She could speak truth to power, even if it cost her everything. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrington." Her voice cut through the restaurant's gentle murmur like a blade through silk. "That number is wrong." The effect was immediate and electric. Veronica's champagne flute froze halfway to her lips, her perfect composure cracking just enough to reveal something sharp and dangerous underneath. Ethan's pen stopped moving, his blue eyes snapping up to meet Aaliyah's with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed. Around them, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere seemed to hold its breath, as if even the crystal glasses sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Ethan's voice carried the particular tone that powerful men used when they weren't sure whether to be amused or annoyed by an interruption. Aaliyah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "The European expansion figures you discussed with your team last Tuesday projected a $43.2 million initial investment. The document shows $47 million. I thought you should know before you signed." The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica recovered first, her society smile sliding back into place like armor being donned for battle. "I'm sure you're mistaken, dear. These are complex business matters." "I'm not mistaken." Aaliyah's interruption was quiet but firm. "I remember the conversation. You were discussing the Munich property acquisition specifically, and Mr. Chen mentioned that staying under $44 million was crucial for the tax implications." Ethan's gaze sharpened, and Aaliyah could practically see his mind working, scrolling through memories and financial projections. For a man who had built an empire on attention to detail, the discrepancy she'd identified was impossible to ignore, even coming from an unexpected source. Veronica's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Ethan, surely you're not going to let the wait staff disrupt our business dinner with..." "What's your name?" Ethan's question cut through Veronica's protest, his attention focused entirely on Aaliyah. "Aaliyah Brooks, sir." "How long have you been working here, Aaliyah?" 6 months, Mr. Harrington." He nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that Aaliyah had come to recognize as his thinking pattern. Around them, other diners had begun to take notice of the unusual drama playing out at the corner table. Whispers started to ripple through the restaurant like stones thrown into still water. Veronica's mask was slipping more noticeably now, her perfect smile developing a brittle edge. "Darling, we really shouldn't let this. You said Mr. Chen mentioned staying under $44 million for tax purposes." Ethan's voice had taken on the laser focus he brought to hostile takeovers and difficult negotiations. "When exactly did you hear this conversation?" Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a heavy coat. She was past the point of no return now, committed to a path that would either vindicate her courage or destroy everything she'd worked to build. But something in Ethan's expression, the first genuine curiosity she'd seen him display in all her months of serving him, gave her the strength to continue. "Last Tuesday evening, around 7:30, you were meeting with your financial team at table 12. Mr. Chen specifically mentioned that going over $44 million would trigger additional EU regulatory scrutiny that could delay the project by 6 months. The accuracy of her recollection hit Ethan like a physical blow. She was right, not just about the numbers, but about details that only someone who had been paying very close attention could have retained. He found himself studying this woman he'd barely noticed despite months of regular service, seeing her clearly for the first time. Veronica's composure finally cracked completely. "This is absolutely ridiculous, Ethan. You're going to let some waitress undermine." "Some waitress who apparently pays better attention to my business discussions than my own fiancé." Ethan's words carried a chill that made several nearby conversations falter. "The question is, how did a $4 million discrepancy end up in a document you prepared?" As security moved to escort Aaliyah out, Ethan raised his hand. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I want to hear what she has to say." But what Aaliyah was about to reveal would expose a web of deception so deep, it threatened to destroy not just Ethan's fortune, but the very foundation of who he thought he could trust. Would you have spoken up like Aaliyah did? Or would you have stayed silent to protect yourself? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next will test every ounce of courage she has. The morning after Aaliyah exposed the discrepancy in Veronica's documents, Manhattan felt different, sharper, more dangerous, as if the city itself was holding its breath waiting for the next revelation. Aaliyah stood at the window of her small apartment in Washington Heights, watching the sun rise over a world that had shifted beneath her feet in the span of a single evening. Her phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with calls from unknown numbers, and she'd finally turned it off rather than face whatever storm was brewing. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of the confrontation at the Sterling Manor. The way Ethan's eyes had sharpened when she'd mentioned the financial discrepancy. The way Veronica's perfect mask had cracked just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. The way the entire restaurant had fallen silent as if witnessing something that would change everything that came after. Her mother's coughing from the next room brought Aaliyah back to reality with a jarring thud. Grace Brooks had been battling chronic respiratory issues for 3 years now, ever since the stress of her husband's death had compromised her immune system beyond repair. The medications that kept her breathing cost more than Aaliyah's rent, and without her job at the Sterling Manor, those pills might as well have been made of platinum. When her phone buzzed again, Aaliyah almost ignored it. But the caller ID showed a number she recognized from the restaurant's reservation system, and something made her answer despite every instinct screaming at her to stay invisible. "Ms. Brooks? This is James Chun, Mr. Harrington's financial advisor. Mr. Harrington would like to meet with you this morning to discuss the matter you raised last evening. Would 10 o'clock work for you?" Aaliyah's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't think that's a good idea, Mr. Chun. I've already said too much." "Ms. Brooks, with respect, I think you'll want to hear what Mr. Harrington has discovered. The preliminary investigation into your observations has yielded some very interesting results." 2 hours later, Aaliyah found herself in the lobby of the Harrington Global Building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. Everything about the building screamed power and money, from the marble floors that reflected her worn sneakers back at her to the security guards who looked like they could bench press small cars. This was a different world from the one she inhabited, a realm where decisions were made that affected millions of lives and billions of dollars. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a woman in an expensive suit who guided her through a maze of glass-walled offices where serious-looking people in $1,000 outfits spoke in hushed tones about market fluctuations and hostile takeovers. Aaliyah had never felt more out of place, more aware of the vast gulf between her world and the one she'd stumbled into. Ethan's office occupied the entire corner of the building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that made the city look like a miniature model spread out for his personal entertainment. He stood with his back to the door when she entered, his silhouette sharp against the morning light streaming through the glass. "Thank you for coming," he said without turning around. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," Aaliyah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Harrington, I need you to understand that I can't afford to lose my job. My family depends on my income, and if this gets complicated..." "It's already complicated." He turned to face her, and she was struck by how different he looked in his own domain. At the restaurant, he'd been polished but approachable. Here, surrounded by the trappings of his empire, He radiated the kind of focused intensity that had built Harrington Global from a small real estate company into a multinational corporation. The question is whether we're going to let it stay complicated or make it simple again. He gestured to the conference table where several manila folders lay spread like cards in a high-stakes poker game. James and his team spent all night going through the documents Veronica presented yesterday. Your memory was not only accurate, it may have saved me from the biggest financial mistake of my career. Aaliyah approached the table cautiously, as if the folders might explode if she moved too quickly. What did you find? Systematic manipulation going back 3 years, Ethan replied, his voice carrying a chill that hadn't been there the night before. The European expansion was just the latest in a series of deals where numbers were adjusted, accounts were redirected, and money disappeared into shell companies that all trace back to the same source. He opened one of the folders, revealing bank statements and transaction records that meant nothing to Aaliyah but clearly told a story that had shaken Ethan to his core. Conservative estimates suggest that $47 million has been siphoned from Harrington Global over the past 3 years. Money that should have gone to acquisitions, employee benefits, charitable foundations, stolen by someone I trusted completely. The weight of the revelation settled over Aaliyah like a heavy blanket. Veronica. Veronica, he confirmed, and the way he said her name suggested that something fundamental had broken between them, something that could never be repaired. The woman I was planning to marry has been systematically robbing me blind, and she was so confident in her deception that she brought the evidence to dinner and asked me to sign it. Aaliyah sank into one of the leather chairs around the conference table, suddenly understanding why Ethan had looked so shaken. This wasn't just financial betrayal, it was personal devastation on a scale that most people never experienced. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I know this can't be easy to process." "Easy." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Ms. Brooks, you've just saved me from marrying a woman who was planning to leave me bankrupt and humiliated. Easy doesn't enter into it." But even as they spoke, Veronica Sterling was already launching her counterattack. By noon, carefully planted rumors began circulating through Manhattan's elite social circles. Aaliyah Brooks, the ambitious waitress who tried to seduce Ethan Harrington by manufacturing a crisis in his relationship. Aaliyah Brooks, the opportunist who'd studied his business dealings for months, waiting for the perfect moment to insert herself into his life. Aaliyah Brooks, the gold digger who thought she could use fabricated financial irregularities to drive a wedge between Ethan and his fiancée. Veronica's network of influence was vast and well cultivated, built through years of charity galas and society functions where reputations were made and destroyed over champagne and canapés. She activated that network with surgical precision, targeting key individuals who could spread her version of events through Manhattan's interconnected web of wealth and power. By the time Aaliyah returned to the Sterling Manor for her evening shift, the damage had already been done. The restaurant manager, a nervous man named Patterson who'd always treated her with polite indifference, met her at the staff entrance with the kind of expression people wore when delivering terminal diagnoses. "Ms. Brooks, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Mr. Patterson, if this is about last night, it's about maintaining the restaurant's reputation and the comfort of our clientele," he interrupted, handing her an envelope that felt as thin as her hopes of appealing his decision. "Your final paycheck, minus the cost of uniform cleaning." Aaliyah stared at the envelope, calculating rapidly in her head. 2 weeks' pay minus deductions wouldn't even cover her mother's medication for the month, let alone rent, groceries, and Marcus's school expenses. "Please, Mr. Patterson. I need this job. My family." "I'm sorry, Ms. Brooks. The decision is final." The walk home felt like a funeral march, each step taking her further from the security she'd worked so hard to build and closer to the kind of desperation she'd been fighting her entire adult life. The apartment felt smaller when she entered it, the walls seeming to press closer as the reality of their situation settled over her like a suffocating fog. Her mother was in the kitchen, trying to hide her concern behind the kind of smile that had gotten them through every crisis since Aaliyah's father died. "How was work, baby?" "I lost my job," Aaliyah said simply, because there was no point in sugarcoating catastrophe. Grace Brooks's smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked every one of her 53 years. "What happened?" Aaliyah told her mother everything: the discrepancy in the documents, her decision to speak up, the investigation that had followed, and the swift retaliation that had left her unemployed and blacklisted from every high-end restaurant in Manhattan. Grace listened without interruption, her expression cycling through surprise, pride, and growing worry. "You did the right thing," Grace said finally, though her voice carried the weight of understanding exactly what doing the right thing might cost them. "Your father would be proud." "Pride doesn't pay for your medication," Aaliyah replied, hating the bitterness in her own voice but unable to contain it. "Pride doesn't keep Marcus in school or put food on the table." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his 17-year-old face bearing the kind of premature seriousness that came from growing up too fast in a family that couldn't afford childhood. He'd inherited their father's height and their mother's gentle eyes, but lately, those eyes had carried a hardness that worried Aaliyah more than she was willing to admit. "I heard," he said simply. "What are we going to do?" Before Aaliyah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Ethan's office number, and she debated letting it go to voicemail rather than face whatever complicated offer might be coming. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and she answered on the fourth ring. "Ms. Brooks, this is James Chen again. Mr. Harrington would like to offer you a position as a financial consultant with Harrington Global. The salary would be significant, and the work would involve helping us trace and recover the funds that were stolen." The offer should have felt like salvation, but instead, it sent alarm bells ringing in Aaliyah's head. "Mr. Chun, with respect, I don't have any formal training in finance or business consulting. Why would Mr. Harrington want to hire someone with my background?" "Because you noticed what an entire team of MBA graduates missed," James replied. "And because Mr. Harrington believes that sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from outside the system." Aaliyah closed her eyes, trying to think through the implications. Accepting the job would solve her immediate financial crisis and provide her family with security they'd never known. But it would also tie her fate to a man she barely knew, a man whose world was so different from hers that they might as well be from different planets. And it would put her directly in the crosshairs of a woman who had already demonstrated her willingness to destroy anyone who threatened her plans. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. But Ms. Brooks, I should mention that Ms. Sterling has been making inquiries about your family. Your brother's scholarship application, your mother's medical coverage. I think Mr. Harrington would prefer to discuss these matters with you directly." The implied threat made Aaliyah's blood run cold. Veronica's reach extended far beyond elite restaurants and social circles. She had access to systems and networks that could destroy the Brooks family in ways Aaliyah was only beginning to understand. That evening, she met Ethan at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan glitter that defined both their previous encounters. He looked different in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, more human somehow, though no less powerful. Money, Aaliyah was learning, was like a cologne that clung to some people no matter how they tried to wash it off. "You look tired," he said when she slid into the booth across from him. "I lost my job today," she replied. "Tired is the least of my problems." "I know. I also know that Veronica was behind it." His jaw tightened as he spoke her name, and Aaliyah could see the struggle playing out behind his eyes, the death of trust, the reconstruction of a reality he'd thought he understood. "She's been busy since our conversation yesterday. Phone calls to restaurant owners, inquiries about your family's financial situation, subtle threats disguised as concern." "Why are you telling me this?" Aaliyah asked. "What do you want from me?" "I want your help," Ethan said simply. "And I want to help you in return. The consulting position is real. I need someone I can trust to help me understand how deep this deception goes and how to prevent it from happening again. Someone who sees what others miss." And what makes you think you can trust me? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but she was tired of being managed, tired of feeling like a chess piece in games she didn't understand. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read a language he'd never encountered before. Because you had nothing to gain by speaking up yesterday, and everything to lose. Because you did it anyway. And because when I look at you, I don't see someone who wants something from me, I see someone who wants to do what's right, even when it's hard. His answer surprised her with its honesty, and she found herself studying him with the same intensity he was bringing to their conversation. This close, away from the trappings of his wealth and power, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of betrayal that had settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. If I agree to this, she said carefully, what happens when Veronica realizes I'm not going away? What happens to my family when she decides I'm a real threat instead of just an inconvenience? I'll protect them, Ethan said, and the conviction in his voice made her believe that he meant it. I'll protect all of you. Over the next 2 weeks, Aaliyah found herself drawn deeper into a world she'd only observed from the margins. Ethan's private office became her second home as they worked through mountains of financial documents, tracing the intricate web of deception that Veronica had woven through 3 years of careful planning. What they discovered was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Veronica hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been building a parallel empire, using Harrington Global's resources and connections to fund her own business ventures. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, real estate investments in Dubai, tech startups in Silicon Valley, all funded with money that should have belonged to Ethan's shareholders and employees. But the financial betrayal was only part of the story. As they dug deeper, a more personal narrative emerged. Veronica had been planning her exit strategy from the moment their engagement was announced, systematically transferring assets and building relationships that would allow her to disappear with her stolen fortune whenever she decided the game had run its course. She was never planning to marry me, Ethan said one evening as they worked late in his office, the city lights twinkling 42 floors below them. The engagement, the wedding planning, the talks about our future together, all of it was just buying time while she cleaned me out. Aaliyah looked up from the documents she'd been reviewing, seeing the pain in his expression and feeling an unexpected surge of anger on his behalf. She'd grown up understanding that rich people had different problems than poor people, but she was learning that betrayal cut just as deep regardless of your bank balance. How long were you together? She asked. 4 years. We met at a charity gala. She was organizing fundraising for children's literacy programs. I thought she was the most beautiful, intelligent, compassionate woman I'd ever met. He laughed bitterly. Turns out she was definitely beautiful and intelligent. The compassion was all an act. Aaliyah set down the papers she'd been studying and really looked at him for the first time all evening. In the soft light from his desk lamp, with his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it, he looked younger, more vulnerable than the commanding figure she'd served at the Sterling Manor. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. I know what it's like to have someone you love turn out to be different than you thought they were. Something in her tone made him look up sharply. You've been through something similar? Aaliyah hesitated, not sure why she was about to share something she'd never told anyone outside her family. But something about the late hour and the intimacy of their shared mission made her feel safe enough to be honest. My father's business partner, she said finally. Uncle Raymond, we called him, though he wasn't really our uncle. He'd been my dad's best friend since they were kids, worked alongside him for 15 years building their construction company. When my father died, Raymond offered to help my mother sort through the business affairs. Turned out he'd been embezzling for years, and when my dad died, he cleaned out what was left and disappeared. Ethan's expression darkened. How much? Everything, Aaliyah said simply. My father thought he was leaving us secure. The business had contracts lined up for years, enough money in the accounts to see Marcus through college and take care of my mother's medical expenses. Instead, we got bills we didn't know existed and debts that took 3 years to pay off. Did you ever find him? Raymond. He moved to Florida, started a new company under a different name. My mom didn't want to pursue it legally. She said the stress would kill her, and she was probably right. But I learned something important from that experience. What's that? People will show you who they really are if you pay attention. The trick is believing them when they do. She gestured at the documents spread across his desk. Veronica's been showing you who she is for 3 years. She just hid it so well that you couldn't see it. Their eyes met across the desk, and Aaliyah felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed the way he looked at her, with an intensity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a growing connection that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. But tonight felt different, more charged, as if all the walls they'd built around themselves were slowly crumbling under the weight of shared secrets and mutual trust. "Aaliyah," he said quietly, and the way he spoke her name made her pulse quicken. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear enough to make her blood freeze in her veins. "Your brother looks so young in his school ID photo. It would be a shame if something happened to that bright future of his." Aaliyah's hands shook as she showed Ethan the message, watching his face darken with an anger she'd never seen before. This wasn't just business anymore. Veronica had made it personal, targeting the people Aaliyah loved most in a desperate attempt to make her back down. "We need to move faster," Ethan said, his voice carrying a steel edge that reminded Aaliyah exactly who she was dealing with. "How close are we to having enough evidence to take to the authorities?" "Close," Aaliyah replied, though her mind was racing with worry about Marcus's safety. "But if we push too hard too fast, she might." Her phone buzzed again. This time the message included a photo, Marcus walking out of his school, unaware that someone was watching him, documenting his movements, making him a target. She might what? Ethan prompted, but Aaliyah was already reaching for her jacket. "I have to go," she said. "I have to make sure my family is safe." "Aaliyah, wait." Ethan caught her arm as she headed for the door. "Don't let her win by making you run scared. We're so close to exposing her." "My brother is 17 years old," Aaliyah snapped, the stress and fear finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "I don't care about your money or your revenge or anything else if Marcus gets hurt because I helped you. Some things are more important than justice, Mr. Harrington." The formal address hit him like a slap, creating distance between them just when she needed it most. But as she reached for the door handle, his next words stopped her cold. "What if I told you I could protect him? What if I could protect all of you?" Aaliyah turned back to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "How?" "Stay with me tonight," he said, and before she could misinterpret his meaning, he continued quickly. "I mean, keep working with me. We'll have security pick up Marcus and your mother, bring them somewhere safe while we finish gathering evidence. 24 hours, maybe 48 at most, and we'll have everything we need to end this." The offer was tempting, but it also meant placing her family's safety in the hands of a man she'd known for less than a month, trusting that his resources and influence would be enough to protect them from a woman who had already demonstrated her willingness to cross any line. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. "You could cut your losses, break up with her, write off the stolen money as a business expense. Why risk escalating things when you could just walk away?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "Because for the first time in years, I feel like I can see clearly. And what I see is that most of my life has been built on lies and manipulation. People wanting things from me, telling me what they think I want to hear, playing roles designed to get them closer to my money or my influence." He moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "But you're different. You've been honest with me from the moment we met, even when honesty was dangerous. Even when it cost you everything." "Ethan." She started, but he continued before she could finish. "I'm not just doing this for justice, Aaliyah. I'm doing it because I can't let her win. I can't let her destroy the best thing that's happened to me in years, just because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Aaliyah felt her resolve wavering, felt the careful wall she built around her heart beginning to crack under the pressure of his honesty and her own growing feelings. "This is complicated," she whispered. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," he replied, reaching up to cup her face with a gentleness that belied his reputation as a ruthless businessman. When he kissed her, it felt like the world tilted on its axis. All the tension and attraction that had been building between them over the past 2 weeks crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. This wasn't just about justice or revenge or financial recovery. It was about two people from different worlds finding something real in the midst of chaos and deception. But the moment they broke apart, reality came crashing back. Aaliyah stepped away from him, her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications of what had just happened settled over her like a heavy cloak. "We can't," she said, though every fiber of her being was screaming that they already had. "This makes everything more complicated, more dangerous." "I know," Ethan replied, but he made no move to close the distance between them again. "But I can't pretend it didn't happen. And I can't pretend I don't care about you." Before Aaliyah could respond, the sound of her phone buzzing cut through the tension. This time, the message was even more direct. "End this now, or your family pays the price. You have 12 hours. The threat galvanized them both, pushing aside the personal complications in favor of immediate action. They worked through the night, gathering the final pieces of evidence they needed while Ethan's security team quietly moved Aaliyah's family to a safe location. By dawn, they had enough documentation to bring criminal charges against Veronica and recover most of the stolen funds. But Veronica Sterling hadn't built her empire on patience and careful planning to be defeated by a rushed investigation. As Ethan prepared to meet with federal investigators, she played her most devastating card yet. Marcus Brooks was arrested on drug possession charges as he left school, the substances allegedly found in his locker during a routine search. The charges were serious enough to destroy his scholarship opportunities and derail his plans for college, serious enough to haunt him for the rest of his life if they stuck. Aaliyah was at Ethan's office when she got the call from her mother, Grace's voice shaking as she explained what had happened. The security detail Ethan had provided was useless against legal charges filed through proper channels, and they all knew exactly who had orchestrated Marcus's arrest. "She did this," Aaliyah said, her voice hollow with shock and rage. "She had my 17-year-old brother arrested on false charges to make me back down." Ethan's face had gone pale as he listened to her side of the conversation with Grace, and she could see him calculating the implications just as quickly as she was. Veronica had escalated beyond financial manipulation into active destruction of innocent lives. "We'll fight this," he said immediately. "I'll hire the best criminal defense attorneys in the city. We'll prove the charges are false." "No," Aaliyah interrupted, and the finality in her voice made him stop mid-sentence. "This ends now. I'm calling off the investigation, and I'm walking away from all of this. Aaliyah, you can't let her win like this. My brother is 17 years old." The words exploded out of her with all the fear and fury she'd been holding inside. "He's never even had a speeding ticket, and now he's facing felony drug charges because I decided to play hero. This isn't worth it, Ethan. No amount of money is worth destroying Marcus's future." The argument that followed was fierce and painful, with Ethan trying to convince her that running would only embolden Veronica to escalate further, and Aaliyah insisting that protecting her family was more important than seeking justice. But even as they fought, they both knew that Veronica had already won this particular battle. Just as Ethan was about to confront Veronica with the evidence, she played her final card. "If you leave me," she whispered with a cold smile, "I'll make sure Aaliyah and her family lose everything. And I mean everything." But what Veronica didn't know was that Aaliyah had been listening from the next room, and what she heard would change her from victim to warrior. Have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing put someone you cared about in danger? How far would you go to protect the people you love? Share your thoughts below. because Aaliyah is about to make a choice that will shock everyone. What Veronica didn't know was that Aaliyah had been recording their conversations for the past week. Every threat, every manipulation, every cold calculation had been captured on the small device hidden in Aaliyah's purse. As she sat in the next room listening to Veronica's ultimatum to Ethan, Aaliyah felt something fundamental shift inside her. The scared waitress who had stumbled into a world of power and deception was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become strategic enough to outmaneuver them. While Ethan wrestled with the impossible choice between protecting her family and seeking justice, Aaliyah was already 3 moves ahead. She'd spent sleepless nights researching Veronica's past, following digital breadcrumbs through social media profiles and society page archives, building a picture of a woman whose entire life had been constructed on the ruins of other people's trust. What she discovered was a pattern that stretched back years. Veronica Sterling hadn't started her career of manipulation with Ethan, she'd simply perfected her technique on him. There had been others, wealthy men and women who'd found themselves inexplicably poorer after extended relationships with the beautiful socialite. Business partnerships that had mysteriously failed, investment opportunities that had vanished along with the woman who'd recommended them, charity foundations that had somehow lost substantial donations to administrative costs that traced back to consulting fees paid to shell companies. But Veronica's victims had stayed silent, bound by shame and the particular kind of pride that made admitting deception feel like admitting weakness. They'd absorbed their losses and moved on, preferring financial damage to social humiliation. Veronica had counted on their silence, had built her entire strategy around the assumption that wealthy people would rather lose money than lose face. Aaliyah understood something that Veronica had missed in her careful calculations. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against predators wasn't money or influence. It was the simple willingness to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Her first call was to Catherine Morrison, a widow whose late husband's art collection had somehow been sold at below-market prices through a gallery that Veronica had recommended. The second was to David Chun, no relation to Ethan's financial advisor, whose tech startup had collapsed after Veronica had introduced him to investors who turned out to be using his company as a front for money laundering. One by one, Aaliyah reached out to the people whose lives had been damaged by Veronica's carefully orchestrated schemes. The conversations were difficult, requiring her to convince successful, powerful individuals that their silence was enabling continued harm. But something in her voice, the same quiet authority that had made Ethan stop and listen that first night at the Sterling Manor, broke through their defenses. "I know this is hard to talk about," she said to Catherine Morrison during their first phone conversation. "But she's doing it again, and this time she's threatening innocent people to cover her tracks. Your story could save families like mine." Catherine's silence stretched so long that Aaliyah thought the call had been disconnected. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the older woman said, "She convinced my husband to donate my grandmother's jewelry collection to a charity auction. We never saw a penny of the proceeds, and when I tried to trace where the money went, the charity had mysteriously dissolved." Each story Aaliyah collected added another layer to the picture of systematic predation that Veronica had been conducting for over a decade. But more importantly, each conversation created an ally, someone whose pain had found purpose in the possibility of preventing others from suffering the same fate. Dr. Sarah Winters had lost her medical research funding when Veronica convinced her to invest in a pharmaceutical startup that had existed only on paper. James Fletcher, a real estate developer, had seen his family's company nearly bankrupt after Veronica introduced him to business partners who were actually using his projects to launder money from overseas. Maria Santos, whose restaurant empire had crumbled after Veronica orchestrated a hostile takeover disguised as friendly investment advice. The pattern was always the same. Veronica would identify successful individuals going through transitions or vulnerable moments, offer friendship and support, gradually gain their trust, then position herself to profit from their downfall. She was like a surgeon of deception, cutting away people's wealth with such precision that they often didn't realize they'd been operated on until it was too late. But Aaliyah was building something that Veronica had never faced before, a coalition of her victims, united not just by their shared experience of betrayal, but by their determination to ensure it never happened again. Within days, She had assembled a network of evidence that painted a picture of criminal activity spanning over a decade and involving millions of dollars in theft, fraud, and manipulation. While Aaliyah was quietly building her case, Ethan was spiraling into desperation. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find a solution that would protect Aaliyah's family without sacrificing the justice they'd fought so hard to achieve. His lawyers had painted a grim picture of Marcus's legal situation. The drug charges were serious and had been filed through proper channels, making them difficult to challenge without concrete proof of their fraudulent nature. The thought of Aaliyah walking away from their investigation, of Veronica winning through threats and intimidation, was eating at him like acid. But the thought of an innocent 17-year-old boy paying the price for his pursuit of justice was even worse. He'd grown up with privilege and power, insulated from the kind of consequences that people like the Brooks family faced every day. The realization that his actions could destroy lives he cared about was a burden unlike any he'd ever carried. He was on the verge of calling off the entire investigation and accepting whatever losses Veronica demanded when Aaliyah finally revealed her plan. They met at the same Brooklyn cafe where they'd first discussed working together, but this time the power dynamic had shifted completely. Aaliyah no longer looked like a woman seeking protection. She looked like a general preparing for war. "I need you to trust me," she said without preamble, sliding a tablet across the table between them. "And I need you to follow my lead, no matter how crazy it seems." Ethan stared at the screen, which displayed a detailed timeline of Veronica's criminal activities going back 12 years. Names, dates, financial transactions, witness statements. It was more comprehensive than anything his team of investigators had assembled. "How did you?" he started, but Aaliyah cut him off. "The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala is in 3 days," she said. "Veronica is going to be there, accepting an award for her philanthropic contributions to children's literacy programs. Manhattan's elite will be there, the media will be there, and thanks to the guest list I obtained from Dr. Winters, who's on the foundation's board, about half of Veronica's victims will be there too." Ethan felt his heart start to race as he began to understand the scope of what Aaliyah was proposing. "You want to expose her publicly, in front of everyone." "I want to give her victims a chance to tell their stories," Aaliyah corrected. "I want to show the world exactly who they've been celebrating all these years. And I want to do it in a way that makes it impossible for her to retaliate against anyone else." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Aaliyah had convinced the foundation's board to allow her to present a surprise tribute video honoring Veronica's charitable work. What they didn't know was that the video would feature testimonials from her victims, laying out in devastating detail the pattern of manipulation and theft that had defined Veronica's real relationship with the wealthy community she claimed to serve. "She'll be trapped," Aaliyah explained. "Surrounded by witnesses, recorded by media, with nowhere to run and no way to spin the narrative. And once the story breaks publicly, the pressure on law enforcement to investigate will be overwhelming." Ethan stared at her across the table, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. This wasn't the scared waitress who'd risked her job to point out a numerical discrepancy. This was a woman who'd been forged in fires he was only beginning to understand, who'd learned to fight battles he'd never imagined having to face. "What do you need from me?" he asked. 3 days later, the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala was in full swing in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Manhattan's elite had turned out in force, their designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos creating a sea of understated opulence that represented billions of dollars in collective wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, while waiters, invisible in the way that Aaliyah had once been, moved through the crowd serving champagne that cost more per bottle than she'd made in a week at the Sterling Manor. Veronica Sterling was in her element, radiant in a cream-colored gown that had probably been featured in Vogue before she'd even put it on. She moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting congratulations on her impending award, graciously acknowledging praise for her philanthropic work, playing the role of Manhattan socialite with the polish that came from years of practice. She positioned herself at the center of the evening's narrative, the beautiful young woman whose dedication to children's literacy had made her one of the city's most celebrated philanthropists. The award she was receiving, a crystal sculpture that would join dozens of others in her penthouse apartment, represented the culmination of years of careful image cultivation. But scattered throughout the ballroom were faces she didn't immediately recognize, people whose lives she'd touched in ways she'd assumed would remain forever hidden. Catherine Morrison sat at table 7, her elegant silver hair styled perfectly despite the nervous energy that had kept her awake for 2 nights. Dr. Sarah Winters was at table 12, her medical research having finally recovered enough for her to attend social functions again. David Chun had flown in from Silicon Valley, his new company thriving despite the setbacks Veronica had caused his previous venture. They were all there, Veronica's victims, gathered in the same room for the first time in their lives, each carrying pieces of a puzzle that would paint a devastating picture when assembled. And none of them looked like victims anymore. They looked like survivors ready to reclaim their power. Aaliyah stood at the back of the ballroom wearing a black dress she'd borrowed from Dr. Winters, her natural curls styled in an elegant updo that transformed her from invisible service worker to commanding presence. She held a small remote control in her hand, the device that would trigger the presentation she'd spent weeks preparing. When the moment came for Veronica's tribute video to be shown, Aaliyah stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom's sound system, cutting through the polite chatter like a knife through silk. Ladies and gentlemen, before we present Ms. Sterling with her award, I'd like to share a special tribute that highlights the true impact she's had on our community. The lights dimmed, and the screens positioned around the ballroom came to life. But instead of the celebration Veronica was expecting, the first image was a photograph of her with Marcus Fletcher, the real estate developer whose company she'd helped destroy. His voice filled the ballroom, calm and measured as he described how Veronica had gained his trust before systematically dismantling everything he'd built. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as Manhattan's elite found themselves confronted with accusations they'd never heard before. Veronica's smile faltered as she realized what was happening, her perfectly composed facade beginning to crack as victim after victim appeared on screen to tell their stories. Dr. Winters spoke about losing her life's work, her voice carrying the pain of dreams deferred and research that could have saved lives. Catherine Morrison described watching her husband's art collection disappear into accounts that had never existed, their family legacy vanishing along with the woman who'd promised to help them preserve it. One by one, the testimonials painted a picture of systematic predation that had been hidden behind charitable galas and society page photographs. But it was the financial evidence that truly devastated Veronica's carefully constructed image. Bank records, forged documents, shell company registrations, all displayed on screens that had been meant to celebrate her philanthropic achievements. The numbers were staggering, the pattern undeniable, the conclusion inescapable. By the time the video ended, the ballroom had fallen into a silence so complete that the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Veronica stood frozen at her table, her face having cycled through shock, rage, and finally a cold calculation that everyone in the room could see. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "This is nothing but lies and jealousy from people who couldn't handle their own poor investment decisions." But her protests fell on ears that had already heard too much truth to be swayed by denials. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonials too detailed and consistent to be fabricated. More importantly, the people telling their stories were members of her own social circle, individuals whose reputations and integrity were beyond question. Ethan watched from his table as the woman he'd planned to marry revealed herself completely for the first time since he'd known her. Gone was the sophisticated philanthropist, replaced by someone whose first instinct was to attack her victims rather than address the accusations against her. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had been torn away entirely, revealing the predator that had been hiding underneath all along. As FBI agents moved through the ballroom, Aaliyah had coordinated with law enforcement to ensure they would be present for Veronica's public exposure. Manhattan's elite found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. One of their own was being arrested for crimes that had been committed against their own community, in their own social circles, under cover of charitable work they had all celebrated. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Veronica's arrest made headlines in every major newspaper, Her charitable awards became symbols of how easily communities could be deceived, and the Sterling Foundation's board immediately launched an investigation into every project she'd been involved with. The ripple effects spread through Manhattan's social scene like cracks in a breaking dam. But perhaps most importantly, the false charges against Marcus Brooks were dropped within hours of Veronica's arrest. The drugs that had supposedly been found in his locker were traced to evidence that had been planted by a private investigator working on Veronica's behalf, and the case against him collapsed as quickly as it had been built. For Aaliyah, watching Marcus walk free from the courthouse was the moment when everything they'd endured finally felt worth the cost. Her 17-year-old brother emerged from the building looking older than his years but unbroken, his future restored and his faith in justice partially rebuilt by seeing the system work correctly for once. But the victory came with complications that Aaliyah hadn't fully anticipated. The media attention was overwhelming, with reporters camping outside her family's apartment building and following her to work at the temporary consulting job Ethan had provided. She'd become a symbol of speaking truth to power, a role she'd never asked for and wasn't entirely comfortable with. More challenging was the conversation she needed to have with Ethan about what came next. They'd worked together toward a common goal for weeks, their professional partnership deepening into something more complicated and difficult to define. But now that the crisis had passed, the fundamental differences between their worlds reasserted themselves with uncomfortable clarity. They met one final time at the Brooklyn Cafe where they'd planned Veronica's exposure, but the atmosphere was different now, charged with unresolved tension and the kind of honesty that comes after shared trauma. "I need to apologize," Ethan said without preamble. "For everything. For not seeing what was happening, for putting your family at risk, for being so blinded by privilege that I couldn't recognize the dangers you were facing." Aaliyah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse but also the beginning of understanding about gaps in experience that couldn't be bridged by good intentions alone. "The apology means something," she said carefully. "But apologies don't change systems, Ethan. They don't fix the fundamental inequalities that allowed this to happen in the first place." Then what would? The question carried real hunger for answers, the kind of openness that came from having your worldview shattered and rebuilt. "Change," Aaliyah said simply. "Real change. Not just in how you do business, but in how power operates in spaces like yours. Hiring practices that actually create opportunities for people who look like me. Investment strategies that consider communities instead of just profit margins. Board positions and executive roles filled by people who understand what it's like to struggle." The conversation stretched on for hours, touching on everything from corporate responsibility to systemic racism, from class privilege to the responsibility that came with wealth and influence. It was painful and necessary, the kind of dialogue that most people from their different worlds never had the opportunity or courage to engage in. Ethan listened more than he spoke, absorbing perspectives he'd never been forced to consider, wrestling with the realization that good intentions weren't enough to overcome patterns of exclusion and inequality that had been built into the systems he'd inherited and profited from. "I want to do better," he said finally. "But I need help understanding how." "Then hire people who can teach you," Aaliyah replied. "Not as tokens or charity cases, but as partners with equal voice in decision-making. Create pathways for advancement that don't require people to abandon their communities or compromise their values. Use your platform to amplify voices that have been silenced instead of just adding your own to the chorus of people who already have power." It was a conversation that marked the beginning of a transformation that would take months to fully unfold. Ethan began restructuring Harrington Global's hiring practices, creating scholarship programs for students from underserved communities, establishing a foundation that provided microloans to minority-owned small businesses. The changes weren't cosmetic. They were fundamental alterations to how the company operated and where it directed its resources. Aaliyah watched these changes with cautious optimism, her role evolving from crisis consultant to strategic advisor to something that felt like true partnership. The professional relationship they'd built during their investigation of Veronica deepened into collaboration on projects that addressed some of the systemic issues they discussed in that Brooklyn cafe. But the personal dimension of their connection remained complicated. The attraction that had sparked between them during their late nights working together hadn't faded, but both of them understood that any relationship would have to be built on more than mutual respect and shared goals. It would require navigating the complex dynamics of race, class, and power that had shaped both their lives in fundamentally different ways. 6 months after Veronica's arrest, Aaliyah found herself in a position she'd never imagined possible. She had an office on the 38th floor of the Harrington Global Building, her title of Strategic Equity Consultant carrying real authority and significant responsibility. Marcus was thriving at Columbia University on a scholarship that Ethan had established but that she'd earned through academic merit. Their mother's health had stabilized thanks to health care benefits that were part of Aaliyah's compensation package. The transformation went beyond her family's circumstances. The programs she'd helped design were creating opportunities for other families like hers, breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. Young people from backgrounds similar to hers were getting internships at Harrington Global, learning skills that would open doors throughout their careers. Community investment initiatives were bringing resources to neighborhoods that had been systematically excluded from economic development. But perhaps most importantly, the way business was conducted in those gleaming corporate towers was slowly changing. Voices that had never been heard in boardrooms were now part of strategic planning sessions. Investment decisions considered community impact alongside profit potential. The invisible people who had once moved through corporate spaces unnoticed were being seen, heard, and valued for their contributions. The relationship between Aaliyah and Ethan evolved at the same pace as these broader changes, slowly, carefully, with constant attention to the power dynamics that could never be completely eliminated but could be acknowledged and addressed. They were building something new, a partnership that existed in the space between their different worlds, drawing strength from their differences rather than being limited by them. The proposal, when it finally came, happened not in some romantic restaurant or exotic location, but in the conference room where they'd spent countless hours working together. They were reviewing the quarterly reports from their community investment initiatives when Ethan looked up from the spreadsheets and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life doing this work with you." It wasn't a traditional proposal, but nothing about their relationship had been traditional. They were partners first, in business, in purpose, in the shared mission of creating change that would outlast both of them. The romance had grown from that foundation, built on trust and respect and the kind of deep understanding that came from weathering crises together. The wedding, a year later, was a celebration that bridged worlds in ways that reflected the changes they'd worked to create. The ceremony took place at the Sterling Manor, but this time Aaliyah wasn't serving the wealthy elite. She was being celebrated by a community that included people from every level of society. Her former co-workers from the restaurant sat at tables alongside Fortune 500 CEOs. Marcus gave a speech that moved half the room to tears, and Grace Brooks danced with Ethan's grandfather, two people from different worlds finding common ground in their love for the couple at the center of it all. But the most meaningful moment came when Aaliyah stood before the assembled guests and spoke about the journey that had brought them all together. She talked about the courage required to speak truth to power, about the responsibility that came with privilege, and about the changes that were possible when people chose to bridge divides rather than accept them as permanent. "A year and a half ago, I was invisible in this room," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had first captured Ethan's attention. "I was just the waitress, someone whose job it was to remain unseen. But I learned something important that night when I decided to speak up about those numbers in Veronica's documents. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay invisible. Sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to say what others won't, even when your voice shakes." As Aaliyah and Ethan stood together, no longer separated by power or class but united in purpose, she realized that the moment she decided to speak truth to power, she didn't just save his empire, she discovered her own. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't staying silent to keep the peace. Sometimes it's having the courage to speak up, even when your voice shakes, because some truths are too important to hide. Their story became more than just a romance between two people from different worlds. It became a blueprint for the kind of change that was possible when individuals chose to use their power and privilege to create opportunities for others. The foundation they established together funded scholarships for students like Marcus, created mentorship programs that connected young people from underserved communities with business leaders, and supported initiatives that addressed systemic inequalities in hiring and advancement practices. The ripple effects of their partnership extended far beyond their own lives. Other corporations began adopting similar practices. Other wealthy individuals started questioning how they could use their resources more responsibly, and other young people from backgrounds like Aaliyah's found pathways to success that hadn't existed before. 5 years after that evening at the Sterling Manor when Aaliyah first spoke those words, "That number is wrong," she stood before a congressional committee investigating corporate governance practices, providing testimony about the changes that were possible when businesses committed to genuine equity and inclusion. Her voice no longer shook when she spoke truth to power, because she'd learned that her truth had the power to change not just individual lives but entire systems. The committee room was filled with representatives from across the political spectrum, business leaders from major corporations, and advocates from communities that had been fighting for economic justice for generations. But as Aaliyah spoke about the transformation of Harrington Global and the model it provided for other companies, she found herself thinking about that scared young woman who'd been afraid to speak up because she couldn't afford to lose her job. That woman still existed inside her, still carried the memory of counting tips and calculating whether her mother's medication could wait another week. But she'd been joined by someone stronger, someone who understood that individual courage could spark collective change, that speaking truth to power wasn't just about exposing lies but about creating space for new truths to emerge. This story proves that no matter where you come from, your voice has power. Your truth matters. And sometimes, one person's courage to speak up can change everything. If Aaliyah's story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters too. What truth have you been afraid to speak? Let me know in the comments, because your story could be the next one that changes everything.